Here, I'm able to reach members of every community in our community here in Houston. And my hope is to try to influence them in some small way so that in a short time from now, when they become the leaders in their community, HBU is able to leverage its influence as they progress and spread around the country.
Dr. John Tyler is with us today, and this is going to be a very special interview. You're not going to want to miss 1 minute of this. He has written a signature article that is in the Houston Baptist University magazine, The Pillars. Dr. Tyler is the HBU professor of law, as well as the director of legal study programs. He practiced as an attorney in Texas for 35 years, even arguing as lead counsel in 2 cases before the United States Supreme Court. He then earned a PhD in philosophy from Texas A&M. His writing and teaching emphasizes the political, moral, and historical dimensions of law that formed the Western legal tradition. He's involved in HBU's pre-law program and is an integral part to the Morris Family Center for Law and Liberty. Such a delight to have you.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you.
The article, and I want to just show the magazine, The Pillars. It is a feature that you simply have to get your hands on, because inside is a signature article from Dr. John Tyler on religious freedom. We're going to talk all about it today. The uniqueness of HBU is that we have great diversity, probably one of the top-ranked universities in the nation.
It is.
And yet we have unique distinction. We're a Christian university.
One of the wonderful privileges of teaching here, and I taught at a large state university for 5 years, but almost all the faces of my students look just the same. Here, I'm able to reach members of every community in our community here in Houston. And my hope is to try to influence them in some small way so that in a short time from now, when they become the leaders in their community, HBU is able to leverage its influence as they progress and spread around the country.
That's an awesome, awesome ambition. You know, I want to just get right to this article that I'm telling you people are reading already and talking about.
Thank
The
you.
War on Religious Liberty by Dr. John Tyler. This is really a magnificent piece of a document that you created. And I want you to walk us through why the title, The War on Religious Liberty.
Well, when I was practicing law, I was very blessed. I worked with wonderful lawyers, both for and against me, the best in the country, both with me and against me in cases.
Yeah.
And I noticed that there were things that were going on in our law that I could not understand, that were so inconsistent with our founding and inconsistent with our legal tradition. And I realized I didn't have the mental toolkit to really understand and put the pieces together about what was happening. So as it turns out, I did recognize that it was the progressive movement, political progressive movement, as they call themselves today, that was really the impetus behind this changing of our governmental structure, our judicial philosophy. And it turns out that the leading man professor in the world on this philosophy in this area, the progressive era, that they call themselves naturalists primarily, but they were a group of American philosophers, and the leading expert on them in the world was a professor at Texas A&M, and his name was John McDermott. He was regularly rated as one of the top 10 living philosophers in the world. And I'd represented A&M and was an alumni of A&M, and so I decided I needed to get the toolkit together and started looking, where can I go to study what the progressives believe? And there it was, right there in College Station. And so McDermott became my dissertation director. In philosophy, you call him a Doktorvater or Doctor Father, and disagreed with me on every religious issue, every political issue, every philosophical issue, just about, except one, and that was he was a liberal in the true sense of the word, that he was very tolerant of opposing views and actually very protective of students that might have opposing views to his. But he was a wonderful teacher, a wonderful man. He recently passed away, and I was very honored to they asked me to finish out his courses that year.
Wow.
So I was teaching the PhD students while teaching the undergraduates here, and it about killed me going back and forth. But while I was there, I gained an understanding of the progressive worldview that is really quite contradictory to the Christian worldview and the view of our founders. And it permeates everything that they do. And so it was trying to come up with an explanation. Why does the Supreme Court sometimes vary from the text? Why do we have now an administrative state when the Constitution does not even allow for administrative agencies? We had a long series of cases that said that Congress cannot create administrative agencies. And then during the New Deal era, when the progressives first got power, they started making these changes and appointing judges, and then that created the war, the opening on to go after Christianity, because they rightly identified Christianity as the number one obstacle to achieving their political agenda.
Wow.
So we had, as I explained in the article, the constitutional jurisprudence assigns different levels of protection, constitutional protection to rights. And the most stringent protection is something called strict scrutiny. So a state or a city or the federal government cannot violate a right under strict scrutiny unless it's absolutely necessary to achieve a compelling governmental purpose. It's very rare that you can do that. Throughout all of our history, religious liberty had been considered a fundamental right that received strict scrutiny protection. And this was true up until 1990. And in 1990, a case was decided by the U.S. Supreme Court that removed strict scrutiny protection from religious liberty. And religious liberty is the only liberty in the Bill of Rights now that does not receive strict scrutiny protection.
Mm.
The great irony of the case is the author was Justice Scalia.
Really?
So Justice Scalia, can I tell you a little bit about the facts of the case? There's really two cases I'd like to talk to you about, because when I teach my constitutional law courses, I like to take two cases that have the same facts and the same legal issues from the same court, yet reach the different result. And then we explain what happened. So there was an earlier case called the Sherbert Case, where a lady was a Seventh-day Adventist, I think in South Carolina. And their Sabbath is on Saturday.
Right.
And she was told she had to work on a Saturday and on religious grounds, and sincerely held religious grounds. She said, I can't do it, so she was terminated. Well, she didn't sue her employer, but she did apply for state unemployment benefits. And the state denied them, saying that if you were terminated for cause, you could not receive the unemployment benefits. And she said, but it was pursuant to my free exercise of my religious beliefs. And she won the case. The Supreme Court said the state could not deny her those benefits because she did something that got her fired because of her religious beliefs. So that case established strict scrutiny protection for religious freedom a fundamental right, and I think it's completely rightly decided. The issue in this case, of course, is not whether we agree with the religious beliefs of the people. It's that they have the freedom to believe what they want to, which is an absolute freedom, and then the freedom to have free exercise of the religion, and that's only limited if it hurts other people. So the case that was decided in Employment Division versus Smith is almost exactly the same on the facts, except the plaintiff was not quite as lovable as a Seventh-day Adventist who's standing up for her belief in the Sabbath. In this case, the plaintiffs were drug counselors at a private drug rehab facility, but they also were members of the Native American Church in Oregon, and they used sacramental peyote during their religious services. So of course they test positive for peyote, which is a hallucinogenic drug, and they're fired by their employer. And obviously, if you're an employer and you're running a drug rehab center, it's probably not good to have your counselors engaging in illegal drug activity. So these gentlemen applied for unemployment benefits from the state of Oregon. So Ms. Sherbert was fired because she did something in her religious beliefs that got her terminated. The same thing happened with these gentlemen, and the Oregon state statute provided that if you were terminated for cause, you could not get unemployment benefits either. So the issue, it looks like it's going to be exactly like the Sherbert case. exactly the same. The same principles would look to apply. So everyone, myself included, back when I used to make predictions about what the Supreme Court will do, I don't do that anymore, predicted that it would be a pretty easy decision. You're going to follow Sherbert, the same principles will apply, and although they couldn't get their job back, they would be entitled to get unemployment benefits based on their claim of religious freedom. But Scalia said no. And Scalia took away strict scrutiny protection and said that any statute can negatively impact religious freedom as long as the religious group is not targeted by name in the statute. And that is a huge change. That change in turn, if you remember the Hobby Lobby case.
Sure. Burwell versus Hobby Lobby.
That's right. Hobby Lobby was the Obama administration issued the famous abortifacient drug mandate, which impacted us here at HBU. And it required that 4 abortifacient drugs be provided to employees by businesses and religious organizations. It was not a statute that was passed by Congress. It was just a regulation that was issued by the Secretary of Health and Human Services, completely an administrative thing, not subject to debate, never issued by an elected official. And it said that if you did not do that, they would put very large fines on you.
I think at Hobby Lobby was facing 1.3 million per day in fines.
Yeah, that's probably right. It's 420 million, something like that, a year. The Little Sisters of the Poor, and if our viewers don't know who they are generally elderly nuns, all of them, almost all postmenopausal. All they do is provide a dignified place for the poor to pass away at a hospital. They do nothing else. They're nuns, they're celibate, they're past childbearing age, they have no need for abortifacient drugs. I believe they were targeted because they're a Christian organization.
Yes.
They were charged $70 million fine a year. And then I believe that the amount for HBU was about $13 million. The amount of the fine was based on the number of employees that you have, but all of these fines for these organizations were ruinous. Well, fortunately, these organizations won their case, but not because of the Constitution. As soon as Justice Scalia issued that, in my opinion, very bad decision and taken away strict scrutiny protection from religious freedom, Congress responded with the Restoration of Religious Freedom Act. And the statute mandates that religious freedom gets strict scrutiny protection. So, using that statute, all 3 of these organizations were able to prevail against the Obamacare abortion mandate. The problem is now, though, that we have a new statute, the so-called Equality Act. The progressive movement, the Progressive Caucus and the Democratic Party has tried numerous Congresses to get it passed, and it's House Bill 5 in this session that finally passed the House this year. And what that provides, it is a very alarming statute. It specifically says that you cannot defend using, in religious liberty cases, the Restoration of Religious Freedom Act anymore. It vitiates that. So that people who, for instance, this would require, if someone self-identified as a female, even though they're male, their access to the locker rooms and all the things that have been in the news. And it specifically provides private causes of action and public prosecutions if a church, for instance, does not want to let boys into the girls' locker room. Now, under the Restoration of Religious Freedom Act, they would get strict scrutiny protection if their refusal to allow admittance is based on their religious beliefs. But under this new statute, if it passes the Senate, that defense will be taken away. And then you will have the full force of the civil rights enforcement actions going against our churches over these issues. So we're in a very alarming situation right now.
A couple questions. I mean, Scalia, as we know, was a man of deep faith. Why did he do what he did with this legal issue that was so? Did he not understand? What was the issue?
No. Scalia's brilliant. This is just my opinion, and I unfortunately never got to meet him. But in my view, Justice Rehnquist, who was Chief Justice when I was in law school and a young lawyer, I think is our academically most gifted justice of all time, and Scalia is a very close second. I'll tell you what I tell my students, but let me begin by saying this is a speculation about the mental processes of another, and I admire Scalia more than I can explain, but we're all human and all make mistakes. I think this was his mistake. I believe that in his heart he did not really believe that this was a valid claim of religious liberty. I think that he probably thought that this was just an excuse, an attempt to use religious liberty to avoid criminal liability for illegal drug use. That's what I think, okay? Because that's completely inconsistent. He was a very pious Roman Catholic gentleman, very, very large family. But in the Roman Catholic, and half my family's Catholic, half my family's Protestant. In the Roman Catholic tradition, and the Catholic universities in our country are the great preservers of our philosophical training, because it is very important in how they train their priests. But the great scholars come from that. But I've learned from living among them now as a philosopher for more than 20 years, in their tradition, unlike the Protestant tradition, they put a greater emphasis on social order, whereas in the Protestant tradition, the great emphasis is on personal liberty.
Sure. And
there's an area where there's a conflict between those two. And so if there's a equal case, the Catholic tradition will say we're going to have order with the right person in charge. The Protestant tradition will say, no, we're going to be in charge of our own things. So the Catholic faith is a top-down faith, obviously. Protestant denominations, many of them are bottom-up, and like the congregation chooses the minister instead of the other way around. So I think that's what's there. The justification that he gave in the opinion, Dr. Johnson, is a great question, is that if we allowed people to claim religious liberty every time they didn't like a statute, then his phrase was that we would be courting anarchy. And that's the language that leads me to think that it's his focus on order, because that's what he says, his focus on anarchy. But the focus on anarchy is the great argument that has always been used against John Locke and his philosophy of government that formed the basis of our personal liberty, our emphasis on liberty in our government. And in fact, the most famous of the philosophers, a man named Jeremy Bentham, who argued against natural law and against individual liberty and argued for a strong central state that has almost unlimited power. The name of his work is Anarchical Fallacies. And he took the opportunity of the Reign of Terror to attack the natural law tradition in our jurisprudence. So it's a constant idea that floats along. I think that's what persuaded Scalia in that case.
We're talking to Dr. John Tyler, and he teaches here at Houston Baptist University, very uniquely an attorney with a PhD in philosophy, board certified in civil law. You get this, there's so much in this article. I'd like for you, and because both in this podcast and the next, we're going to try to highlight the, shall we say, the table of contents or the major points. Can you tell us synoptically where you were going with that?
Sure. There's four major points. Two of them deal with progressives. Two of them deal with Christians. So the first one is, why do progressives attack religious liberty? And I give their underlying philosophy, which is what I studied, getting my PhD in philosophy. And I had the world's greatest professor to teach me what they say. And the thing I want to say about it is many people who accept that do it in absolutely good faith, and they're good people and well-intentioned people. Then the second part is how progressives attack religious liberty. And here we depart from good faith to some degree, but there have been 7 lines of cases that the United States Supreme Court has reviewed that are 7 different tactics that progressives have used in the court system to try to erase Christianity out of our culture. Then the second part of the article is, why should we defend religious liberty? And I go into the justifications for that. And the main idea is that if you look through history, and all of my courses emphasize the philosophical history and the legal history of the civilizations from which we get our laws. There's a saying in the law from Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. that a page of history is worth a volume of logic in understanding the law. And what we see by looking at history, both the history of England but also the history of Athens and the history of the Roman Republic, is that religious liberty and personal liberty, political liberty, always rise and fall together. They always rise and fall together. And if you destroy religious liberty, the other liberties will fall as well. And I'll give an explanation as to why that's the case, why I think it's the case. It's a historical fact, but I try to explain it. And then in the last part, I talk about how we should defend religious liberty. And I lay out 6 lines of cases that have been overwhelmingly successful, 6 legal strategies that have been overwhelmingly successful. And lately, in the 60s, when I was, I'm going to date myself, but when I was in junior high and high school, we seemed to lose every case that came up on religious liberty. That, however, has now changed, and we now have a great track record of winning case after case after case. One of the most important ones that just happened is the Bladensburg Cross case, a 32-foot cross that was a war memorial to dead in World War I. And the American Civil Liberties Union went after that and tried to get all Christian symbolism away from war memorials, and the Supreme Court held no. You can do that. In the town of Greece, there was a town in New York where a small city would open their public meetings with a public prayer. Atheists attacked that to try to stop that from happening, and the Christians won in the Supreme Court on that case as well. So there's been a greater recognition and respect for religious liberty, but the problem is the courts are always going to be limited by the statutes that come out of Congress. And if the so-called Equality Act comes through, since the Supreme Court has taken away strict scrutiny from religious liberty under the Constitution, this statute takes away strict scrutiny protection under federal statutes, and that will completely reverse the trend that we've had in our favor.
The Equality Act, who was the chief proponent behind that?
Oh, I can't tell you who the sponsor was.
Right.
But it
has passed the House.
It passed the House.
And now, is it in the Senate?
It's in the Senate. I don't think it'll ever make it to the floor
Right.
with McConnell there. But, we have a very razor-thin, the Republicans, when I say that, I'm not neither Republican nor Democrat, but the people who are most likely to respect religious freedom and defend it have a very, very thin margin right now, as we've seen with this issue on the whether we're going to have witnesses in the impeachment. So I think it's a 53 to 47 or so.
Right.
It's a very, very close thing. If as few as 3 of those Senate seats change parties in the next election, then Democrats have a majority there, I'm certain that this bill will find passage. And that will be a very sad day for us.
The repercussions would be beyond really what we could even begin to think about.
Right. Anyone that's self-identified as a group, the statute specifically says even if they're mistaken, if they self-identify as a group that's admitted into one of these areas, you have to let them in. Mm-hmm. And it covers churches as well. So the churches, if a church refuses to have men go into the ladies' restrooms, then they have liability under that act, and there's no protection.
It's just kind of unthinkable. When you and I were in high school, you would have never imagined a day where there would have been confusion or debate over if a guy goes to a guy's restroom or vice versa. I mean, it's just unbelievable how far we've come in such a short time.
And this is why I call it the war on religious liberty. If they can get protection, they can deprive religious liberty of protection, okay, then there will not be the obstacles to what they want to accomplish. Maybe if I could just mention what the underlying philosophy of the progressive movement is, because it's really, I think, important for our viewers to understand. And this was the last big piece of the puzzle that, by my philosophical studies, I was able to understand. The leading philosopher in this area, they're American philosophers, two in particular, John Dewey and Sidney Hook, and they were both at Columbia University. And what they wanted to do, they saw that philosophy was losing respect in academia, and they wanted to restore respect given philosophy by aligning it to the methodology of natural science. So they developed a philosophy in which they said, if God exists, then we'll have to be able to find him through the methods of natural science. If right and wrong, if morality exists, it will exist in the physical universe, and we'll have to find it there. And so one of the quotes from Sidney Hook that I have in there is that they end up, using science. They can't find an experiment that proves God. So the quote in there is that they reject God for the same reason that they reject leprechauns and goblins and things of that sort. Now, once that happens, then where do you go for your values? Mm-hmm. Right. And the progressive movement replaces God literally with the state. And where the founders saw government bound up with all the strengths and weaknesses of human nature and saw that we needed to restrain the power of government, the progressive movement redefines human freedom in a very interesting way. And this is the key idea, I think, to understanding the world in which we live now. They define freedom not as the liberty to do the things we ought to be able to do. They define freedom as the fulfillment of human potential. Now think about that for a second. Fulfillment of human potential. And they believe that the state's powers should be unlimited in order to achieve human potential. And the way the state does that is by solving every medical, economic, political problem that human beings have. So the state should have broad, almost unlimited powers, and the state should even have the project of remaking man into a new creature. So the state has a semi-divine status. Now obviously Christianity and our founders are opposed to that. It gives unlimited power to the state and very little power to the individual. This progressive idea is so extreme when you get into it. There's a man named Trotsky in Russia who was a Marxist. He also identified Christianity as the primary adversary to the revolution that they wanted. But he was Jewish by ethnicity and culture, but he was not a believer. But he actually wrote a piece that the Russian Justice Department followed, saying that just as the generation of Jews that did not go into the land at Kadesh Barnea, how that generation had to die before the Jews could come into the Promised Land, every person in the Soviet Union would have to die to make room for the next step in human evolution that they called the new Soviet man. And that was the big push of their law. So they called their legal department, instead of the Commissariat of Justice, they called it the Commissariat of Liquidation. And they actually hired Italian industrial engineers to streamline a system so that they could kill as many people as they could to bring that about. They ended up killing, we believe, 60 to 80 million Russians in order to bring about this. Are
those the purges of Stalin? And
yes, those were they were actually before Stalin's purges, but Stalin's purges were less idealistic. That was just to kill anybody that had leadership potential that could be a threat to him later.
You know, I have a pastor friend in Moscow, and he has told me, about the tremendous historical tragedy in Russia with regard to even its own government.
It really is, and I went to St. Petersburg, to all the sites of the revolution, and actually sat in Lenin's desk and went where some of these important things happened, so I can tell the students and take pictures and show them that this is what happened. But it's really, once God is out of the picture, once there's no transcendent moral order to restrain human impulses, then mankind's nature is released, and we can see just what level of evil we're capable of. So the main point of the founders is to understand that liberty and power are in an adversary relationship with each other, and power must be minimized in order to maximize liberty. The progressive movement wants to get rid of these limitations on state power in order to accomplish what they want to accomplish. And obviously, if they don't believe that God exists, they also do not believe that there should be any protection to religious liberty. And there's one gentleman who I met when he was a professor at University of Texas, who's now at the University of Chicago, and his name is Brian Leiter. And he wrote a book in 2012 entitled Why Religious Tolerance, or Why Tolerate Religion? That's a question mark. And he argues and uses, these are his words, not mine, that religious belief is unhinged from evidence and that it is a, quote, culpable religious or culpable mental state that should not be tolerated. Mm-hmm. And so he is one of the guys that he teaches constitutional law at University of Chicago. I believe that's his area. But he writes in the book that he was motivated to write this book against religious tolerance because, in his view, Christians have, in his words, a pernicious influence on education and politics in Texas, and he wants to get rid of them. So that's the reason that there's now a war, and it's being fought in the courts on religious liberty. That's the motivation behind it, because as we insist on liberty, we limit the power of the state to accomplish the things that the progressives think are important.
Wow. Dr. John Tyler, this is the issue that contains the signature piece by Dr. Tyler on the War of Religious Freedom. I want you to come in close because I want them to see this masterful article. That it's something really that every believer needs to know, needs to be literate in. There's so many people who love God and have faith, and they don't have a clue what's happening. And it's just tragic because we're called to be salt and light. I want to also point out beautiful brand new book that's come from the Morris Center for Law and Liberty at Houston Baptist University. Just come in close and take a look at this, The Origins of Our Founding Principles. This is put out just within a few weeks.
Right,
a week.
Yes.
So tell us about the book, if you would.
Well, when I was, I had lunch one day, years ago, I guess 8 years ago, with Chris Hammonds. And I was thinking about maybe coming to HBU and starting a pre-law program here. And we hit it off. We even played the same board games as kids, and we hit it off. And so we were talking, I said, we really ought to have some kind of an institute for our founding principles, because these principles, kids from who've never been exposed to them, but from every ethnicity in our city, they're drawn to these when they're explained to them for the same reason that I am. They're beautiful principles. And he just looked at me kind of with his mouth open. He said, well, I'm already working on that. And so and he was the Dean of Liberal Arts then, and he resigned from that position, became the head of this, and Dr. Morris gave us a wonderful endowment. And Chris had the vision of this book, and I've written 4 of the chapters, but
wow, beautiful.
We talk about the influence from the Roman Republic, from what happened. The Roman Republic's the model of things, how to do your government, but what happens if you get away from your constitution. Athens is a model of what to never do in your government. Right. And then my focus is on England during the 17th century, which is, they fought the same battles that we fought politically in our American Revolution, but they did it a century earlier. And so I have a chapter on the influence of the Protestant Reformation, on how our liberties, religious liberty and political liberties rise and fall together. Have a chapter on the natural law tradition, how that originated actually with Socrates and was developed in Rome and then in England, then adopted in Blackstone and entered our law there. And we have some wonderful professors here, and I don't remember the total number, but there's probably 10 of us that have contributed one or more chapters there. And it gives the historical, the governmental, the philosophical, and the religious background.
Let's come in and show a picture of what will be on the HBU campus, which is the Morris Family Center for Law and Liberty. Groundbreaking in a short order, and before long, construction begins on what is very reminiscent of Independence Hall.
Yes, it's going to be an almost exact duplicate, except I think our building code required it to be a little bit taller, which of course is we're completely
Texas.
happy with Texas with that. But one of the great things about that, Dr. Johnson, is when I teach my constitutional law courses, I'll be able to teach them in the room, a duplicate of the room in which the Constitution was drafted in Philadelphia. So that's going to be a wonderful experience, and we hope to have tours for junior high, high school, elementary school kids to come through and expose them to our incredibly beautiful heritage, which is now being lost in many of our academic institutions.
Yes.
And we want to be the salt and light that preserves that and helps bring about a renaissance of those values.
So good. Thank you, Dr. John Tyler. This is another reason why we give to make HBU's vision happen. It's making a difference, really making a difference. Can you imagine a young student coming to one of the classes of Dr. John Tyler as opposed to one of the progressives in a secular university? Can we even begin to calculate just one student trained properly what the impact is in the future? That's why you can go to hbu.edu/giving, give online. We have people at 281-649-3222 that can help you with that. And remember, there is a place for you at HBU. 281-649-3211 is the admission number. And there is no question that we don't have answers to help guide you to find a home. It's the very reason why so many students decided to come to HBU, where I hear all the time, this is a family. The professors truly care. Think about that in a world today of such heartache and grief. Be sure to get Dr. John Tyler's signature piece on the War of Religious Liberty in the Pillars magazine. You can go to hbu.edu/pillars and pull it up right from the convenience of your computer. Look forward to talk to you again.
Thank you. Look forward as well.